Great, thank you, Abby. As Abby has said, I'm going to talk about co-design, and I'm going to talk about co-design in the context of people who've got language impairments. So this is an interdisciplinary stream of work that we've been engaged in for 6 or 7 years, probably now at City. And it involves Abby herself, and Tim, who's somewhere else in the room, where's Tim at the back, and our colleague Jane Marshall, who's in the Division of Language and Communication Science here at City. And this talk actually aligns very nicely with some of the stuff that Dimna was talking about in the previous talk. So although we hadn't conferred about this at all, she's very conveniently introduced and covered some of the things that I want to talk about. So thank you, Dimna, for saving me a bit of time here today. So what I want to talk about is co-design. And I want to talk about co-design in the context of people who've got a communication impairment. So as Dimna has already introduced co-design, I don't want to say very much about it other than it's something I think that many people in this room will have engaged with already. And it's really about a fundamental rethinking of the role of users in the design process. So we no longer think of users as people who we as researchers or designers consult with, but we think of them as active participants who have an active and creative role in design activities. So they're making an active contribution to creating technology that they themselves might use. And this, of course, is particularly attractive, I think, when we're talking about designing for users who've got complex needs, for whom it's quite difficult for designers to actually understand their needs. So co-design seems a particularly appropriate approach, as in the Scampi project, for working with people with dementia, for working with people with Parkinson's. But that poses new challenges, because it's actually, if we start to think about the approaches that we use for co-design, they're not necessarily well adapted to including people with special needs in the design activities. So the challenge that we've been looking at across a series of projects here at City is how to ensure that the co-design techniques themselves are accessible to people with particular impairments. And the particular impairment that I've been working with Abby and Tim is an impairment called aphasia that some people have after they've had a stroke. And I'm aware that this is not a condition that a lot of people are familiar with, so I'm going to say a little bit about that first before I go on to talk about the particular co-design techniques we've been using. So this is a statistic that some of you may or may not be familiar with, but approximately 1 in 5 women in the UK and 1 in 6 men in the UK will have a stroke in their lifetime. So something like 20% of the people attending this event today will have a stroke at some time in their life. And about 25% of strokes happen in people who are under the age of 65. That's a lot of people who have a stroke. And of people who do have a stroke, about a third of the people who survive are left with a communication impairment called aphasia. This is an impairment that leads to people having difficulty finding words, so difficulty in producing speech and in constructing sentences. They have difficulty understanding words, so things that are spoken to them, difficulty reading, difficulty writing, and it's quite variable. It changes quite a lot from one person to another. So one person might have almost no spoken language at all, but be able to read a little. Other people might have more spoken language, but find that it's very difficult to read following the stroke. Quite often, because they've had a stroke, they've also got challenges with mobility, and they may well have some right side paralysis, which again can inhibit your ability to use technology. So I'd just like to show you a short video of somebody who has aphasia, who has quite severe aphasia, just to demonstrate what this condition is like. So the person you're going to see in the video was a teacher before he had a stroke. He's had a stroke, he's now got quite severe aphasia that has a serious impact on his ability to produce speech. So hopefully this will work.
So Gerald, I just wanted to talk to you a bit about your stroke and your aphasia.
Yeah. Sorry, it's not very loud.
Right, I curved there.
Wait, just pause and increase the volume slightly, if I can.
So it's September 2007?
Yes.
Is that when you had your stroke?
Yes.
Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's 2 years ago now?
Yes.
Yeah. And what happened when you had your stroke?
Well, I got to that.
So you stopped
can't do it.
Speak, right.
But there are, get there, sort of thing.
Yes?
Yes. Thank you. I got to, yes, I got to,
Is that, are you talking about reading?
yes, I got.
So reading's okay?
Yes.
But it's speaking.
That's fine.
really
And if I couldn't, there's no, I can't do.
Do you mean thinking of a
That's fine.
word?
That's fine.
Right.
I can't do your.
Right. So do you mean it's...
Okay, so I'll stop that there. So this is Gerald. He's had a stroke. He's got quite severe aphasia. Although he's producing quite a lot of words, he has a very limited vocabulary, but he can read a bit more than he can actually say. Now, you can just imagine the challenges that this poses for using technology, and therefore for designing technology for people like Gerald, we want to include them as well as possible in the design process. But this also poses challenges for actually including people in the design activities themselves. Because if we start to think about the techniques that we use when we're designing, they typically involve lots of use of language. And that's one of the things that's been concerning us in a series of projects. How do we work with people who've got language impairments in a fruitful way that enables them to contribute to co-design activities? Just a few other stats before I move on to actually talk about what we've been doing in terms of co-design. So I think the numbers are actually slightly higher than this. 367,000 people in the UK who live with this condition, and there's approximately 45,000 new cases each year. There could be somebody on your street who's living with aphasia, but it's a very invisible condition, so often we aren't aware of it. And this is emphasised by this quote from the National Aphasia Association in the United States. Aphasia affects about 1 million Americans, more than Parkinson's disease, cerebral palsy, or muscular dystrophy. About 100,000 Americans are diagnosed with the condition every year, but most people have never heard of it. So it's very invisible, but potentially very debilitating, and has a significant impact on people's everyday lives. So there are compelling reasons to involve users with aphasia in design of technology for them to use. But as I just said, many co-design approaches make assumptions about how people can participate in design activities, and that's what we're setting out to try to tackle in our work on looking at co-design. For example, we had a mention by Kia earlier on about post-it notes. Lots of designers love post-it notes, but if you can't read and you can't write very well, then post-it notes are not a very fruitful tool for involving you in a co-design activity. So across 3 research projects here at City, we've been investigating how to involve users with aphasia in design. And really sort of distilling the wisdom across those projects, what's become clear to us is that what we're trying to do is substitute language with other modalities, not completely replace it, but generally try to reduce the use of language and replace it by other, more tangible ways of communicating. And what I'm going to do is show you a few examples of how we've been doing that. Our first example came from, what I'm not going to do is say very much about the projects themselves and the technologies they were developing. I'm really focusing on the co-design activities here. So I think a nice example of what I mean by saying about making it tangible is on a project where we wanted people to co-create avatars. We didn't ask them to create an avatar on a screen using a tool that was quite complicated. Instead, we printed out lots and lots of pictures of avatars, cut them up, laminated them, and got people to pick and mix their own avatar, which we could then create for them subsequently when they wanted to use a particular virtual world that we were working with. So it's a nice way of seeing how something that requires quite complex interactions on a computer can actually be made very physical and therefore very accessible to somebody within a co-design workshop. More recently, we've been working on a project where we're interested in enabling people with aphasia to create and access digital content. And in the course of thinking about tools for people with aphasia to do this, we've run a series of co-design workshops. And I'm going to talk about 2 of the techniques that we've used in those workshops to facilitate the co-designer's participation. So the first technique is a technique called Someone Who Isn't Me. And it's quite similar to something that Jim actually talked about. It's a technique to broaden constituency by asking co-designers to identify and represent a specific other person who also has aphasia and within the co-design activity. So instead of just representing their own view, they identify a specific other person and talk about them and talk about what their experience of this technology would be like. And we'd used this previously, just getting people to identify somebody and remember that person and talk through where they were able to verbalize about the person that they were thinking of. But this, I think, poses challenges in itself. And so we went a step further in our current work to try to make this more concrete. So what we did was we co-designed personas using this SWIM approach. So we got all of our co-designers, we worked with 4 co-designers in these workshops, to describe somebody whom they knew and that person's aphasia. And we did this in a very collaborative way, so each of our co-designers with aphasia worked with somebody who didn't have aphasia to capture this information, and we emphasized creating a very concrete representation of this information. Secondly, we created new personal details, so we took real details of a person with aphasia, but we created new personal details to give them that sense of realism that makes personas so attractive. We took this and then distilled it to create a persona, and then we're gradually evolving and using these personas in subsequent work on the project. So we had, I know you can't read this, the details don't really matter, but this is the kind of concrete, tangible representation that we used in co-designing these personas. So we had this conversation with a person who had aphasia to get them to describe somebody else with aphasia, if you follow me. So they would tell us a bit about the person, and in particular they would tell us concrete details about this other person's aphasia. And that's immensely valuable because it's not us sitting there inventing details about somebody's aphasia, it is actually somebody else's aphasia. So here we've got details of what, for example, a particular person struggled with, which was speaking. So they were talking about somebody who could only say and couldn't speak in sentences. But it also says things that they were good at. So this person that we're talking about was good at being active and liked to sing in a choir and things like that. So we've captured real details of aphasia. And then on the second part of it, we captured fictional details. So we again had a bit of fun inventing details, of what a person might be like, where they might live. In this case, it says that they're going to live in Rayleigh in Essex. They're married with 3 kids. They like walking. They support West Ham. That was a bit controversial. And as the time went on, people got more and more into creating these fictional details, which was a bit of fun, that sat alongside the very serious thing about capturing details about the aphasia. And then after that, what we did was we distilled something that looked a bit more like the personas that you're probably all familiar with. But note they're a bit probably lighter on language than some more conventional personas. Certainly a bit fewer words in them than the ones that Dimna just showed us. And we're continuing to evolve these. So now Jimmy is looking a bit like this, and we'll bring them back to future workshops and see if we need to add some more information in the future. So we've got Jimmy, who's a fictional person, but he's got the detail of a real person's aphasia as part of the persona. And we think this is going to be a really valuable tool in our later stages of our work when we want to think about how other people with aphasia might experience different types of technology. And the second thing I want to talk about briefly is a technique called erasure. So as I said, the current project we're involved in is about creating content and about giving people with aphasia tools to create digital content. And we want to explore the possibility of people being creative in developing that content. So could people with aphasia be given tools that enable them to create poetry online or create prose online, which is clearly going to be something that they will find difficult. So we wanted to explore this technique called erasure, which is a form of what's called found poetry, created by erasing words from an existing text and then framing the result as a poem. And we were keen to explore this as a way of perhaps enabling people to create poetry, but a way that is less challenging than just saying, write a poem, because certainly I would find that a very challenging thing, even without aphasia. So the technique works a bit like this. You give somebody a text, they redact it, and leave just some interesting words or phrases behind, and they will form the basis of a poem. So we did this in ourselves, first of all, and this is one of the texts that we used. So you can see that from the source text, there's just a few words left. Or another person did it like this. So instead of actually scoring out the things they didn't want, they've just highlighted the words that they did want. And from this particular text, we then pulled out the words that were left, the phrases that were left, and constructed a poem. So didn't speak, part disembarked, fading, mouth gone, old sense lurking, future reaching, balrogs make moves, but escape not possible, INCA staying. So it might not be brilliant poetry, but it certainly sounds a bit like poetry, I think. And it's a much easier challenge for people to do, to redact an existing text and construct something like this from it, than to sit down from scratch and produce a new poem. So we wanted to explore whether our co-designers with aphasia could also do this, and whether or not it's something that would be interesting to them and would be something that might be supported in the future by technology. So how did we do this? Clearly, giving a text like this to somebody who's got a language impairment and asking them to create a poem from it would be unreasonable. So what we wanted to do was create a more tangible, concrete way of doing this that people could participate in. So what we did was we created a tangible erasure technique to reduce the burden for people with language impairments to participate in this activity. And we did this by taking a text and printing it out, very tangible. We've lined up all the words, but this is actually a bit of text from Harry Potter. It talks about owls and things, that's how you know it's from Harry Potter. So this is the equivalent of the source text. And then, instead of asking people to go and redact it themselves, we provided little grids so that if you align it properly, they cover it up for you and you just get a few words left. So we're kind of providing a support for people to redact the poetry. And we then use this in a co-design workshop to get people to explore creating a poem from a source text in a way that was facilitated by this very tangible tool. And then Tim took the idea a step further and produced a little app that did the same thing. So on the left-hand side, we've got a source text. On the right-hand side, you can see this is the image of the paper-based one. But Tim took the idea a bit further and developed an app to do the same thing. And we've got a little video of how that works, where you see a source text, and basically when you press the button, it's automatically redacted, and you can pull out a poem, or what might be construed as a poem. So we've got, in fact, you can't read it, it really doesn't matter. It's just what you can see is this idea that from the source, we just pull out a few words here and there, and then see if we can actually construct something that is something a bit like poetry from it. Way the tree has heart in this case. Or do it again. Of rude Eden. So we explored this in our workshops, and it was the co-designers with aphasia find this that they could use this technique to produce a poem. It might, again, not have been the most brilliant poem, but it actually was a rewarding experience for people to be able to use this adaptation of a technique in order to create a piece of poetry. And that's a quote from one of them at the bottom of the slide there. It was a surprisingly rewarding experience. I think when we started to do it, they felt quite intimidated by what they were being asked to do, but actually it provoked a lot of conversation. People were successful in being creative and producing a poem at the end of the process. So what have we learned from this? The point here is not so much about the erasure app, the tangible erasure app itself, nor about the personas themselves, but what we've learned about creating or running co-design activities for people who have a language impairment such as aphasia. And what we've learned is, first of all, the importance of taking time when we're doing any of these activities, and perhaps that is the most important lesson, is they take time. They take a lot more time than you might think co-design activities are going to take. And then secondly, how do we adapt existing techniques so that people with aphasia or probably other language impairments can participate? Well, what we've tried to do is to create the abstract to replace the abstract with more concrete representations, or to supplement things with more concrete representations. So when we're creating personas, we have a form or a template or something to work with where we capture concrete details. And secondly, to replace language with tangible artifacts. So we replaced the need to use language in doing the erasure activity by actually having a physical artifact that enables people to do that instead. And we think that these basic ideas can be applied to lots of different co-design settings. We just have to think a little carefully each time about how we can reduce the language and enable people to participate through making things more tangible and less verbal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steph. That's excellent work. I just said excellent. Completely impartial perspective, of course. Does anybody have some questions or comments that they'd like to respond to? Yeah.
Yes, hi. So my sister has aphasia and she uses WhatsApp a lot. So she uses a combination of like taking pictures, emojis, and audio files to communicate with the family. So I'm curious to know if you've used this sort of existing tools as part of the research or for any project.
Well, we have, I don't know, we've not used them on this particular project. We have got people to come and tell us about the tools that they currently use, and we have explored the challenges that people face, of what people find they're competent at doing and where they're facing barriers. And we've done some user testing of things, well, not actually WhatsApp, but Facebook and Twitter and similar things, in order to understand in more detail the accessibility issues that some of those particular apps provide. So I suppose the answer is yes, we've done some work on that, but what we're not aiming to do is produce a kind of WhatsApp equivalent on this project. We're trying to think about not just about people sharing content, but about people actually creating new content as well, which is why we got into the whole thing about exploring ways of scaffolding people in creating poetry. So, I mean, if you want to find out a bit more about what we've discovered about accessibility of certain sorts of apps, we'd be happy to talk to you afterwards. Yeah.
Yep, for sure.
Yes.
I really like the tools that you're using, and so right now in my research, I'm a PhD student. In my research, I'm looking at creating future fictions for food, and when we talk about food, it becomes quite limiting for people to express what can future be like. So I think some of the tools that you're using with language can be quite a tool to explore for people to express something that they really don't know too much about, or they're even speculating about the future.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's a really interesting idea, actually. I think what we're talking about here is tools to provoke some sort of creativity that don't place too much of a burden on the participants. And, in our case, we're particularly thinking about how to reduce the language burden. But in general, there's lots of techniques around for provoking or encouraging creativity that you might also want to look at.
Just a clarification question, really. So when you say like facilitate with concrete representations,
Yeah.
is that just about the swim personas that you are using?
That's a particular example of it, but we've been doing this when we've used a series of other techniques as well. So, for example, when we do user testing, for example, involving people with language impairments, we tend to have concrete representations of rating scales, if we want to do that. So with visual, like thumbs up and thumbs down on the ends of the scales and things like that. So almost anything that we're doing, we're starting to think, instead of just talking about it, can we make it concrete as well? So it could be a concrete representation of a poem. It could be the tools to support the swim technique. It could be the avatars. Everything we're doing, we're sort of saying, how can we make something more concrete to help people engage in this activity?
Can I mention one more example
Yeah.
as well, which is we use high fidelity prototypes, so we don't use kind of paper mock-ups of systems, which might require quite a lot of abstraction. Say, okay, I can imagine if this was on a screen, it might look like that.
Yeah.
We make kind of physical high fidelity prototypes.
Yeah. So don't use wireframes, anything like that. It's much better to have something that actually looks realistic and concrete.
Okay.
And also, sorry,
Oh, yeah.
also to add, like things like think aloud, for example, are very hard to language. So one thing you can do is actually get them to be themselves as they exist. So you're not giving them a journey like, you are John and you want to buy some lawnmower blades, whatever. You're setting them a task with your present.
Okay, so we've got 2 more questions, I think, and so get this way first.
It's a bit of an observation. I used to work with a group of students who had acquired brain injury, and one of the things that I found really helpful was using pictures, but actually in the sense of giving agency to people, where like we give them the camera, and they had different tasks where they could take pictures of themselves, how they wanted to be seen, their favourite place in the institute where they worked, and I found that worked very well in terms of also then having a knock-on where you could print out the photos, and some of them were able to write, some of them not, and then you could use it as a tool as well, which I found
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, thank you for that suggestion. We've not used it in our current project, but something we've used, kind of a photo diary technique previously, where we said to people just go and take photos of situations where you find communication difficult, for example, and then we've used that as a basis for discussion in the workshops.